They say some men are born bad. Clay McGowan wasn't born bad. He just never saw a reason to be good. By the time he crawled into Dust Creek with a lungful of blood and a bounty on his head, he'd outlived his luck, his gang, and every soul who ever dared to care about him. He was ready to die, alone, unloved, forgotten. But fate's cruelest joke wasn't death. It was handing him a marriage license, and a woman everyone in town called the ugliest in the territory. What he didn't know was this: she didn't need saving. She needed a reason to fight, and when the bullets came, she didn't run. Stay with this story, because by the end you'll see why Clay McGowan stopped running, and why they say ugly is just another word for unforgettable, like share. And subscribe if you believe love can come from the unlikeliest places, and sometimes redemption rides in wearing a bonnet and a limp. Chapter 1. Dust and Blood Clay. McGowan didn't ride into Dust Creek. He stumbled. His horse had given out 10 miles back, somewhere along the Broken Ridge Trail where the rocks turned red and the buzzards circled low. He'd put a bullet in the beast's skull himself. Mercy, not malice. Then cinched his saddlebag over one shoulder and pressed on foot through the desert heat. Now, as twilight bled across the sky like a wound, Clay's boots left a staggered trail of blood. Behind him, one step at a time, there was a bullet near his lung. He could feel it with every breath, a hot iron rattling against his ribs. His shirt was crusted with sweat, dust, and blood, and the left sleeve hung limp where he'd cut it open to bind the worst of the bleeding. His wide-brimmed hat shaded, a face hollowed by fever, sun, and too many sins to count. Dust Creek shimmered on the horizon like a promise or a lie. It wasn't much to look at. A line of buildings along one crooked street, hemmed in by mesquite and heat. The wind smelled like horses, gun oil, and old wood. And even before he crossed into town, Clay could feel the eyes, the way people always looked when they thought they recognized something foul crawling out of the past. He reached the well behind the livery and drank deep, straight from the rope bucket, water spilling down his chin and soaking his filthy collar. When he looked up, a boy no older than 10 was watching him from behind a corral fence, eyes wide as copper coins. Clay tipped his hat, then turned and limped toward the only place he knew wouldn't turn him away. The church sat at the edge of town, small and sagging, its steeple leaning like a drunk against the sky. Clay pushed through the wooden doors without knocking. Inside it was dark and quiet, save for the low creak of pews and the hush of shifting dust. A man stepped out from the shadows near the altar, tall, lean, wearing a collar that had seen better decades. "Clay McGowan," he said, voice flat. "As a tombstone, Reverend," Clay rasped. Then he coughed, and a thin line of blood traced his bottom lip. "Still owe me, don't you?" Reverend Josiah Granger nodded once. "I do. Need a name. Roof. 2 weeks, maybe 3. You're dying." "Not fast enough," Clay muttered. Then he staggered, dropped to one knee, and grabbed the back of a pew for balance. Josiah moved fast, helped him up, slung Clay's arm over his shoulder, and half-carried him through a side door into a back room that smelled like candles, linen, and old sorrow. "You're not safe here," Josiah said once Clay was flat on a cot. "They hang men like you now. Don't even ask questions first." "You owe me, preacher," Clay reminded him through gritted teeth. "I'm not saying no." Then the Reverend sighed, sat down at a rough-hewn desk, and took out a blank ledger page. "You need a name that ain't yours, something legal." "Got something in mind?" "I've got a niece," Josiah said slowly. "She's got land. Not much, but the town council wants it bad. Only way she keeps it is if she's got a husband." Clay blinked, more blood showing in the whites of his eyes than ought to. "You want me to marry some—" "It's a name on a paper," Josiah snapped. "Nothing more. You get a roof, she gets to keep what's hers." "What's wrong with her?" Clay asked. Not cruel, just curious. Josiah stood. "You'll see." She arrived after dark. Clay was half conscious, the fever eating him alive. But he remembered the sound of her boots, soft, uneven steps across the wooden floor. He remembered the smell of wild sage and clean skin. He remembered the cool press of a cloth against his brow. When he opened his eyes, she was there. A plain woman in a gray dress, hair pulled back tight, mouth set in a line that spoke of years without softness. "Miriam," Josiah said, "meet your husband." Her eyes scanned Clay's face, his wounds, the pistol tied to his thigh with a strip of leather, and the jagged scar across his collarbone. She said nothing, only nodded once and picked up a needle. Clay passed out before the first stitch. He woke 2 days later to the sound of pages turning. The pain was still there, deep and mean, but his vision had cleared. He lay in a simple bed in a small wooden room. A fire crackled low in the hearth. Rain tapped against the roof. And across the room, in a straight-backed chair, sat Miriam. She was reading. Her face was no softer in the firelight. Chin too sharp. Nose crooked where it had likely been broken once. Her lips moved slightly as she read, though no sound came out. "You married me," Clay croaked. She looked up. "It was that or lose my land." "Well," he said, voice like gravel. "Thanks for the honesty." She closed the book. "Don't expect much, Mr. McGowan. I cook what I can. I don't clean for men, and I don't take kindly to drunkenness or raise voices." He studied her a long moment, then said, "You shoot?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "Well enough," Clay grunted. "Then I reckon we'll get along." By the end of the week, Clay could sit up. By the end of the second, he could stand. The wound still oozed, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. But he managed short walks, usually from the bed to the porch and back. Miriam never hovered. She fed him, spoke little, and read aloud by firelight when the silence grew heavy. One night, as lightning flickered far off on the plains, Clay caught himself watching her, the way her fingers moved across the page, the way her brow furrowed. When a passage moved her, he found himself asking, not for the first time, "What's a woman like that doing all alone out here?" But he didn't ask, not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened to the sound of her voice. Low, steady, unafraid. For the first time in years, Clay McGowan fell asleep without his hand on a gun. Chapter 2. The Terms of Survival. The first time Clay stepped outside Miriam's cabin, he felt like a ghost stepping into his own grave. The air was dry and clear, with the smell of creosote and wood smoke carried in the morning breeze. Clay stood on the small porch, one hand on the post, his legs unsteady beneath him. The world looked sharper than he remembered, brighter. He could see the hills stretching into the horizon and the windmill creaking in the distance like a weary old man refusing to fall. The cabin sat on a patch of stubborn land just east of Dust Creek, where the grass turned golden and the road was more dust than trail. There was a broken fence line near the corral, a vegetable garden gone to weeds, and a rusted wagon under the mesquite tree. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And now, by law at least, it was his too. Miriam stood at the garden with a hoe in, her hand and a wide-brimmed hat on her head. She didn't look up when he stepped out, but she spoke all the same. "Stay out of the sun. You ain't healed." "Just need air," Clay muttered, voice like splintered pine. "You'll need lungs for that." He gave a dry chuckle and lowered himself onto the edge of the porch. They'd been married 5 days now. No ceremony, no ring, just a paper signed by the Reverend and a silent agreement between two people who didn't care much for ceremony. But already Clay was starting to understand a few things about Miriam. She was plain, yes, but not empty, not cold. There was strength in her, the kind that doesn't beg to be seen. By midday, Clay had made it as far as the corral. He leaned against the fence, watching the single mule chew through a patch of hay. Miriam returned with a tin cup of water and handed it to him without a word. Her fingers brushed his, rough, calloused, and warm. "You built this?" he asked. "My father started it. I finished what he didn't. On your own." She shrugged. "Most things worth doing are." Clay sipped the water. It tasted like the well, deep cold, and earned. That night, Miriam didn't read. She sat at the table, mending a shirt with a needle so fine Clay could barely see it move. Her hands were quick, practiced. Clay sat by the fire, a blanket draped, over his knees watching the flame dance. "You don't ask questions," he said finally. "You don't answer them." He considered that. "Fair enough." Miriam didn't look up. "But I'll ask one now. Go ahead. You've killed men?" It wasn't a question. Just air turned into something heavier. Clay didn't flinch. "Yes." "Why?" He leaned back, winced as the bullet wound tugged. "Some deserved it, some didn't. But it was always me or them," Miriam nodded, tying off the stitch. "Then you'll understand when I say I won't let this land be taken. Not by papers, not by threats." His gaze settled on her. "Who's trying to take it?" She paused. "Councilman Arley says it's not productive. Wants to claim it for grazing. Been sending men to lean on me." "Lean how?" "Ride past at night, rattle the gate. One time they shot a mule." Clay's jaw tightened. "You tell your uncle?" Josiah says to pray. "I say prayer needs a backbone." He smiled at that. "You got one, that's for sure." Miriam looked up. "That why you stayed alive this long?" "No," Clay said. "I think I just got meaner than death." 3 days later, the first rider came. It was dusk. Clay was on the porch sharpening a borrowed knife, testing the edge with his thumb. Miriam was inside, making cornbread. The horse clomped up slow, dust trailing behind like a bad omen. The rider was lean, sunburned, with a shotgun slung casual across his lap, and the look of someone who'd never been told no. "Evenin'," he called. Clay didn't stand, just nodded. "Mrs. Crowley live here?" "She's inside." The man's eyes flicked toward the door. "Councilman sent me to make an offer." Clay tilted his head. "We ain't buyin'." "You sure about that?" At that Clay stood, slow, measured. The knife was still in his hand, gleaming in the last light of day. The rider's smirk faded. "You can tell Arley this land's spoken for," Clay said. "And if he sends another dog, he better send one that don't flinch." The man's hand twitched toward the shotgun, but something in Clay's eyes, or the scar under his jaw, made him think twice. He turned the horse around without another word and disappeared into the dust. Later, Miriam said nothing about it, just served cornbread and beans like it was any other night. But when Clay rose to go to bed, he saw something new on the mantel above the hearth, an old oiled shotgun, loaded, ready. She caught his glance and said simply, "Like I said, I shoot." Well enough. And Clay, who'd been running from death longer than most men lived, felt for the first time like maybe there was something here worth not running from. Chapter 3. Something Worth Defending. The days stretched long and bright, and Clay's wound healed slower than he liked. He didn't complain, not out loud. But each time he tried to do more than his body allowed, chopping kindling, digging, a fence post, lifting the feed sack for the mule, Miriam's voice would stop him cold. "You want to rip that stitch again? Be my guest. Just don't bleed on the porch." It wasn't cruelty. It was fact. Miriam spoke in truths, not comforts. By the second week, Clay found himself waking early, watching the way the light shifted across the floorboards, listening to the familiar creak of Miriam's steps in the next room. She cooked breakfast with quiet efficiency, cornmeal mush or biscuits if there was flour, and poured coffee that could knock a bear flat. They didn't talk much in the mornings, but it wasn't silence filled with anger. It was a silence of people who understood the value of words and the weight they carried. Clay was no longer a stranger in her house. He was becoming something else. Not a husband in the full sense, not a partner not yet, but something steadier, like a stone in a riverbed, always there. It happened on the 16th day. Clay was in the barn brushing down the mule when he heard the rattle of wagon wheels on gravel. He stepped to the opening doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. The sun was behind the visitor, making the outline stark. A wagon, 2 men up front, and a third walking behind with a clipboard. Councilman Arley, Clay didn't need to be told. The man had the smug look of someone who'd already written the "I" ending and just came to collect his prize. "Beautiful morning," Arlie said, stepping down. "Hope we're not interrupting chores." Clay didn't answer. Miriam came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood beside Clay, not behind him. "We're here to make a final offer," Arlie said. "The council voted last night. If you sign today, we can offer double what we did last month, cash in hand. You'll have 3 days to vacate." "No," Miriam said. Arlie blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Clay leaned against the doorframe. "You folks always try to buy folks off with velvet and smiles first." Arlie's gaze narrowed. "And you are?" "Husband," Clay said. "Name's Crowley now." "The Pike?" Councilman's eyes twitched. "Didn't think you the marrying type?" "I wasn't." Arlie stepped forward. "Look, no need for trouble. The council has plans. That land'll be used for cattle. Progress. You understand?" Clay spat in. The dirt. "I understand you came here thinking you'd find someone scared enough to fold. You're new here, don't know how things work." "I know how men work," Clay said. "And I know you brought 2 guns with you, just in case." Arlie's face tightened. "You threatening me, mister?" Clay straightened. "No, just letting you know. If you come back with more men, bring someone who can write your will." Arlie stared for a long second, then turned to Miriam. "You're making a mistake." She didn't flinch. "I've made bigger ones. This ain't one." The councilman climbed back into the wagon, gave a short nod, and rode off without another word. That night Miriam brought out the bottle. Clay watched as she poured 2 short glasses of rye and slid one across the table. "You drink?" she asked, used. "2? Well, you still got a liver, far as I can tell." They clinked glasses. Clay took a cautious sip and winced. "Hellfire," he muttered. She smirked. "I keep it for cold nights and bad news." "Which is this?" "Both." They drank. In companionable silence. After a while, Miriam leaned back in her chair and stared into the fire. "My father built this place with bare hands and busted ribs. Took him 4 years. Then he got sick. Real sick. Town doctor didn't come, said he wasn't worth the ride." Clay listened. "I buried him out by the tree line," she said. "After that, Arlie started sniffing around. Said the land was going to waste. I told him to go to hell." "You always fight like this?" "Only when it's worth fighting for." Clay set down his glass. "Then I'm damn glad I married you." She looked at him, not softened, not smiling. But something passed between them. An understanding. A thread. A tether. "You ever going to tell me the whole story?" she asked. Clay didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Someday," he said, "when I can say it without spitting blood." "Fair enough." That night, Clay sat on the porch long after she went to bed, shotgun across his lap, watching the stars burn holes in the sky. And for the first time in years, he wasn't waiting to die. He was waiting to defend something. Chapter 4. Tracks in the dust. Clay heard them before he saw them. 3 riders, maybe 4. Hooves muffled by the dry earth, but still too fast, too purposeful to be friendly. It was late afternoon, hot and still, and the wind carried dust, like smoke across the hills. Clay set down the axe he'd been using to split kindling and stepped quietly to the side of the cabin. Miriam was out back hanging laundry. She didn't see them yet. He whistled, sharp and low, and within seconds she rounded the corner, wiping her hands on her skirt. Clay met her eyes and nodded once. She didn't ask questions. She disappeared into the house while Clay checked the revolver at his side. They came into view soon after, 4 men, all mounted, with rifles strapped to their saddles and faces that bore the smug weight of impunity. One wore a sheriff's badge, not Dust Creek's, likely from Briar Hill, a town known for loose justice and tight pockets. The leader raised a hand in mock greeting. "Afternoon, we're looking for a man, goes by Clay McGowan." Clay didn't move. "That name means something. To you, means $50 to me, dead or alive." Clay stepped forward into the open. "Funny thing, men come here looking for that name usually leave with fewer teeth. The sheriff at Weiss, Kiebar, if that's what he wa, didn't laugh. "You're harboring a fugitive, lady," he called toward the cabin. "You could hang for that." The door opened. Miriam stepped out with the shotgun. "I know the law," she said. "And I know this land. He's my husband. He's got papers. He's not a fugitive. Not in Dust Creek. And unless you're here on official business, I'd ask you kindly to turn those horses around." One of the men snorted. "You threatening?" "Lawman, missy. I'm protecting what's mine." Clay's voice was low, lethal. "You boys got papers? Warrant? Seal from a federal court?" Silence. "Didn't think so." The leader dismounted. "You know, a lot of women around these parts would be glad to get rid of a man like you." Miriam cocked the shotgun. "She ain't?" "Most women," Clay said. The man studied him, then Miriam, then spat in the dirt. "We'll be back." "You do that," Clay said. "Bring a coffin." They left in a cloud of dust, but Clay knew this wasn't over. The price on his head wouldn't disappear just because the paper changed. And now Miriam was in it, too. That night, Clay sat by the window, cleaning the revolver, piece by piece. Miriam didn't ask what he was thinking. She brought him a plate of beans and biscuits and sat across the room, reading like always. But she watched him. "Who'd you kill?" she asked finally. Clay's hand paused, then moved again, slow and methodical. Too many to name, some who had it coming, one who didn't. She closed the book. "Tell me." Clay exhaled through his nose. The fire cracked behind her. "I was 17. Robbery gone wrong. Bank teller reached for the shotgun under the desk. My partner froze. I didn't." He didn't look up. He was 23, just got married, had a baby on the way. Miriam didn't speak. The silence filled with all the things she wasn't saying. I told myself I had to. Told myself it was him or me. Was it? Clay looked up. "Doesn't matter now." She stood, crossed the room, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not the same man who pulled that trigger," she said. "No," he said, "but I ain't sure I'm a better one." She didn't answer. Just left her hand there a moment longer than necessary before turning away. 2 nights later, the storm rolled in. It wasn't the kind that came from the sky. It came on horseback, with guns drawn and vengeance in their hearts. 4 men again. Maybe the same, maybe different. Didn't matter. What mattered was they didn't knock. The first bullet hit the window. Clay rolled off the cot, dragging Miriam to the floor. Glass shattered. The fire roared with sudden wind. Clay reached for his rifle, shoved it into her hands, watched the back door. "Anyone moves, shoot." "What about you?" He didn't answer, just crawled low across the floor and braced himself by the front window. Another shot tore through the frame. He returned fire. A scream echoed outside. 1 down. Boots scraped on the Talmud porch. Clay slid sideways, rifle ready. The door creaked open, slowly, cautiously. Clay waited. The silhouette appeared, shoulder first. 1 clean shot, 2 down. From the back the shotgun boomed. Miriam, then silence. Not the silence of fear, the silence of death. Clay stood slowly, blood running down his arm, where a splinter had gouged him. He stepped outside, rifle raised, just in time to see the last man limping toward a horse. Clay didn't fire. "You tell whoever sent you," he shouted. "This land is claimed, and we don't miss twice." The man mounted, barely, and vanished. Into the dark, Clay turned. Miriam stood in the doorway, shotgun still raised, face pale but unshaken. He walked up the steps, stopped in front of her. "Still think you're the one who needed protectin'?" She let out a breath. "I never did." He looked at her then. Really looked. Strong jaw, crooked nose, limping leg, steady hands. And in that moment, Clay McGowan knew this woman wasn't just worth dying for. She was worth living for. Chapter 5. Ashes and Oaths. The morning after the shootout, Clay buried the bodies. He didn't ask Miriam to help. She came anyway, holding the spade while he dug. The ground was hard, dry from weeks without rain, and the sun already beat down like judgment. They didn't say much, just worked. 1 shovel full at a time, 1 breath at a time. The men didn't carry papers, no badges, no names, just bullets and hate. Clay went through their saddlebags and found nothing but spare cartridges, a cracked flask, and a torn flyer with his name half legible beneath a blood smear. "Someone's still paying," he muttered. Miriam stood at the edge of the shallow grave. or someone still scared. They burned the rest. Saddles, bedrolls, whatever couldn't be used. By sundown, the smoke curled up into the purple sky like a warning. That night, Clay cleaned the blood off the porch. Miriam scrubbed the wall where a bullet had splintered through the frame. Inside, the cabin was quiet. The fire burned low. They sat across from each other, tired, covered in dust and ash. "You don't have to stay," she said finally. Clay looked up. "You could leave, ride out tomorrow. Try some place where they don't know your name. I wouldn't stop you." He didn't answer right away, just looked into the flames. "I've run enough," he said. "And I figure if they're going to come for me, better here than hiding behind another lie." Miriam watched him. "This isn't just about the land anymore." "No," he said, "it's not." She stood and walked to the door, paused. "You really going to fight every man that comes here with a name on a paper?" He nodded. "If I have to," she turned back to him, "then we'd better prepare." The next few days passed like smoke through fingers, slow but sure. Clay took stock of what they had: 1 shotgun, 2 revolvers, a rifle with a cracked stock, and a box and a half of ammunition. Not much, but enough to hold the line for a while. He rebuilt the fence, adding nails where they wouldn't be expected, reinforcing the gate with barbed wire. Miriam drew water, salted meat, and boiled cloth for bandages. They didn't speak of what might come, only of what needed doing. One morning, Clay caught her practicing with the rifle. He watched from the porch as she steadied herself behind a fence post and fired. The bottle she aimed at shattered clean. "Not bad," he said. "I don't miss." "Twice either," she replied, lowering the gun. Clay smiled. On the 4th day, Josiah Granger arrived. He came on foot, a Bible in one hand and worry in his eyes. "Clay met him at the edge of the yard, I heard," Josiah said. "You hear who sent him?" Josiah shook his head. "No one's talking, but word's getting around. You should go. Take Miriam and run." Clay crossed his arms. "Not running." "You're not safe?" "Was I ever?" Josiah looked past him toward the house, where Miriam stood on the porch. "She's not like you, Clay. She's not made for this." Clay shook his head slowly. "You're wrong, preacher. She's more made for it than I ever was." Josiah didn't argue. He just handed Clay a folded paper. "If it comes to it, this is a pardon, signed by a judge I used to pray beside. He owes me a favor." "Don't ask what I had to trade." Clay stared at the paper like it might catch fire. "Why?" "Because I remember the boy who saved my daughter from drowning, not the man who did what he had to in Kansas." Clay nodded, took the paper. Didn't say thank you. Didn't have to. That night Clay read the pardon under lamplight. It was real. Sealed in blue wax, signed with a name he recognized. He could leave, walk into town, trade it for peace. But something in him wouldn't let go. He walked outside, found Miriam at the well, arms crossed against the night chill. "I got a pardon," he said. She didn't turn. "Are you leaving?" "I could." Silence. "But I won't." Miriam finally looked at him. "Why?" "Because I don't want to live free if it means leaving this behind." She nodded. Then, without warning, leaned forward and kissed him. Not soft, not shy, but solid. Real. When they broke apart, she whispered, "Then we fight. Together." And Clay McGowan, for the first time in years, felt the weight of something deeper than regret. He felt what it was to be chosen. Chapter 6. Burn what can't be bought. 3 days of peace passed like borrowed time. Clay fixed the barn door that had sagged since spring. Miriam spent the mornings in the garden, coaxing the reluctant squash vines into a trellis. They didn't. Talk about the pardon folded beneath the hearthstone or the 4 graves out near the north fence. They just lived. For a few precious days, they lived. But in the West, peace never comes without a price. It was midday when they smelled smoke, not wood smoke from the chimney, not the familiar curl of bacon grease or lamp oil. This was thick, acrid, burning leather, old paint, hair, Miriam dropped the wash basin. Clay was already outside. The wind carried the fire from the east, from Dust Creek. They ran to the ridge. The town was burning. Plumes of black smoke rose in oily columns. Screams echoed off the hills. Clay pulled the spyglass from the saddlebag and scanned the streets. Horsemen. 7. Maybe more. Torches in hand. Guns drawn. People running. A saloon. Already collapsed. The church roof caved in, and one rider stood still in the center of it all, a man in a black coat with a gold pin on his collar. "Arlie," Clay muttered. He finally showed his teeth. Miriam stood beside him, eyes hard. "This ain't just about land anymore." "No," Clay said. "It's a message. To us." They rode into town before sundown. Clay carried the pardon in his coat, his rifle strapped to his back, his revolver loaded and ready. Miriam rode beside him, shotgun across her lap. Dust Creek was smoke and ash. Josiah Granger knelt beside the church ruins, coughing blood into a handkerchief. Clay dismounted, helped him to his feet. "They came before noon," the preacher rasped. "Said Dust Creek was harboring a criminal. When no one gave you up—" "They burned it anyway," Miriam finished. Clay gritted his teeth. "Where'd they go?" Josiah nodded toward the hills. "They're camped east, Dry Ridge. 2 miles, 30 men." "30?" Miriam asked. "They brought bounty hunters, mercenaries, maybe even lawmen from out of state." Clay helped Josiah sit. "You got anything left?" The preacher pulled a folded map from inside his coat. "A trail they ain't watching. If you go tonight, you'll reach them before dawn." Miriam took the map. Clay looked at her. "We ride at midnight." They packed light, extra cartridges, rope, 2 knives, a bundle of cloth soaked in kerosene. "Burn what can't be bought," Clay said. Miriam nodded. "And leave nothing they can use." The ride to Dry Ridge was cold and quiet. Coyotes howled. In the distance, but otherwise the land was still. Clay's breath steamed in the moonlight. His shoulder ached. But his eyes stayed sharp. He was no longer running. He was hunting. They spotted the camp from a bluff above the canyon. 30 men, just like Josiah said, fires lit, horses tied, some drunk, some playing cards, others sharpening knives and laughing. Like the war was already won, Arlie sat in a high-backed chair brought all the way from town. He sipped from a silver flask, coat gleaming with gold embroidery. "Fancy for a man about to lose everything," Clay said. "What's the plan?" Miriam asked. Clay looked at her. "Start with fire." They waited until half the camp was asleep. Then they moved. Miriam circled wide, dousing the far end of the supply wagons. Clay moved low along the rocks, placing the soaked cloth under tents and kindling. At once they lit the ends. The flames rose fast. Shouts erupted. Horses screamed. One tent exploded in a bloom of orange as gunpowder caught. Men stumbled from sleep, grabbing rifles, running blind. Clay picked off 2 with clean shots before slipping back into the shadow. Miriam stood behind a broken log, shotgun raised. A man lunged at her with a blade. She didn't hesitate. One pull. He dropped. "McGowan!" Someone screamed. Then came Arlie's voice. High and panicked. "Bring me his head!" Clay moved fast, staying low, bullets whistling past. He found Arlie behind a wagon, pistol drawn. "Thought you'd buy the whole town," Clay growled. Arlie fired. Missed. Clay didn't. The bullet hit Arlie's shoulder. He dropped the gun, screaming. "Please," he cried. "I can offer more." Clay grabbed him by the collar, dragged him out into the firelight. The camp was in ruins, bodies strewn. "Tents gone, mercenaries fleeing. You burned Dust Creek?" Clay asked. "I was just trying to take what was mine." "It wasn't yours." Miriam walked up behind him, barrel pointed steady. "And now you've got nothing." Clay looked at her. "What do we do with him?" Miriam didn't blink. "Let the town decide." Clay nodded. They tied Arlie's hands, left him at the preacher's doorstep with the silver flask stuffed in his mouth. Justice sometimes didn't need a rope. The next morning, Dust Creek began to rebuild. Miriam helped sort lumber from the rubble. Clay worked alongside Josiah, laying fresh beams for the church roof. No one called her plain. No one called him outlaw. They were Clay and Miriam Crowley now, married in name. bonded in blood, and every evening, when the sun sank low and the world felt quiet again, they sat on their porch, two guns at rest, but never forgotten. Chapter 7. Smoke Still Rises. 2 weeks passed. The walls of Dust Creek went up board by board, blistered hands and sweat-streaked faces, doing the work of redemption. Clay repaired doors, Miriam taught a widow's boy how to mend fence, and Josiah. Granger stood every morning where the pulpit used to be, reading scripture from a crate, his voice hoarse but steady. They didn't speak of Arlie. No one asked what became of the men who rode with him. Some were buried out in the canyon. Others fled to places where the name McGowan still turned heads. But no posse came, no lawman rode in, only silence, and the slow, stubborn return of life. Miriam planted corn. Clay built a new pen for the mule. The pardon still sat beneath the hearthstone, untouched. One evening, as cicadas buzzed and the sky bled orange at the edges, Miriam sat by the porch steps with a book in her lap. Clay smoked a hand-rolled cigarette, watching the shadows. "Stretch across the hills. Been quiet," she said. Clay nodded. "Too quiet?" "No," she said, "the right kind." He took a drag, let the smoke rise slow. "You ever think about what's next?" "Next?" "After the rebuilding. After the whispers stop. What we do with it all." Miriam closed the book. "I want to keep the land, plant proper, maybe get another mule, build a smokehouse, start fresh." Clay smiled. "That's a lot of work." She gave him a sideways glance. "Ain't scared of work?" He chuckled, coughed once, then winced. The lung still hadn't fully healed. Some nights it burned like it wanted to crawl out of him. "You ever want children?" he asked suddenly. She didn't answer right away. Then, "Used to?" He looked at her. "Used to?" "Figured I wasn't the type men wanted to make a home with. Figured it wasn't in the cards. You think different now?" She turned her head, met his gaze. "I do." He reached over and took her hand. That night the sky turned black with storm clouds. Lightning cracked over the hills. Thunder rolled, like God shifting in his sleep. Rain lashed the windows and soaked the ground till the cabin smelled like earth and pine. Miriam didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, blanket around her shoulders, watching Clay stir in his fevered dreams. He muttered names she didn't know, cried out once, hand twitching toward a revolver that wasn't near. She knelt beside him, cool cloth on his brow, whispering until he stilled. "You're safe," she said. "You're not alone now." In the morning the air was clean. The ground steamed in the sun. The barn creaked. A bird sang from the rafters. Clay woke slowly, eyes adjusting to the brightness. Miriam sat beside him, book closed in her lap. "How bad?" he asked. "You kicked the blanket off," she said. "And you drooled," he groaned. "Sorry?" She leaned down and kissed his cheek. "Don't be." Then, without ceremony, she stood. "There's a man coming today." Clay sat up. "What kind of man?" "A doctor. Granger sent word to White Rock." Clay scowled. "I don't need—" "You do," she said, "and I ain't asking." He muttered something under his breath. She tossed him a clean shirt. "Put that on. We're not dying today." The doctor arrived by midday. Young, nervous, sweated too much. Clay didn't like him, but he let him poke and prod, listened when he said the lung was healing but slow. The fever might come back. He needed rest, real rest. "Not much of a killer if I'm stuck in bed," Clay muttered. "You're not a killer anymore," Miriam said from the door. He looked at her, saw the finality in her eyes. He nodded. "No, I'm not." By sundown, the doctor was gone. Miriam sat with her feet in a tin basin, humming a tune Clay didn't know. He watched her, noticed how the light caught in her hair, how the scar on her chin had faded, how she looked somehow more beautiful every time he blinked. She caught him staring. "What?" "I was wrong," he said. "About what?" "You, me, this whole damn thing. I thought I was marrying a name on paper." She raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" "Now?" "I think I married the strongest woman west of the Rockies." She smiled, small but real. "That's more like it." Clay stood, crossed the porch, and took her hand. Then, Maybe tomorrow, he said. We go get a ring that fits. She looked at their hands, then at him. Only if it's iron, she said. Something that won't break. Clay McGowan grinned for the first time in years. Deal. Chapter 8. Iron and Ashes. The morning sun rose behind a soft layer of clouds, diffusing gold over the hills and sending long shadows across the ground. Clay woke before the rooster crowed. His chest still ached some, but the fever had passed. For the first time in months he felt solid, like a man, not just the shadow of one. Miriam was already at the stove when he came in. Eggs cracked, bread rising, coffee bubbling like an old friend. She didn't say good morning, she didn't have to. They'd long passed the need for such formalities. Town's quiet, she said, sliding a pan into the firebox. Too quiet? Clay asked, smirking. She shook her head. Right kind. After breakfast, they hitched the mule to the wagon and set off down the road toward Dust Creek. Clay wore the cleanest shirt he had, the one with only 2 patched bullet holes. Miriam wore her Sunday dress, boots scuffed from years of hard ground, and the bonnet with the faded blue ribbon. She didn't fuss with her limp, just walked proud, as if daring the world to say something. The town had changed. The church had a roof again. The general store had been rebuilt with help from 2 miners who'd come down from Black Hollow. Even the saloon had fresh paint, though its doors still hung crooked, like they remembered. Folks didn't stare when Miriam and Clay walked in. They nodded, some smiled, a few tipped hats. The whispers had stopped. At the back of the mercantile, behind, a counter cluttered with canned beans and iron nails, sat a wooden box labeled Weddings and Funerals. Clay opened it and chose a band, iron, as promised. They didn't make a fuss of it. Josiah signed the papers again, this time with no lies, no covers. Clay McGowan's name went down in ink next to Miriam Crowley's, and no one blinked. I'm not charging you twice, Josiah said dryly. But I expect you to show up on Sundays now, Clay grinned. We'll think on it. Miriam just nodded. No promises. Josiah leaned back in his chair. You two have changed. We had to, Clay said. This place changed us. No. The preacher said, you changed it. On the way home, they stopped at the ridge. The graves were still there, marked with rocks and pinewood crosses. Clay looked out across the valley and thought about every mile that had brought him here, every man he'd buried, every wrong he couldn't take back. Miriam stood beside him, arms crossed. You ever wish things had gone different? She asked. Didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at his coat. No, he said finally, because then I wouldn't be here with you. She nodded once. That was enough. That night they built a fire behind the house. Miriam brought out 2 chairs. Clay brought the bottle Josiah had left them as a gift. They sat in the flicker of flame, watching sparks rise like ghosts toward the stars. You still keep that pardon? She asked. Still under the hearthstone, Clay said. You ever going to use it? Maybe. They passed the bottle. Shared silence. Then Miriam stood, walked inside, and returned with the folded paper in her hand. Without a word, she dropped it into the fire. Clay didn't stop her. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash. What if they come again? He asked. Miriam looked at him, voice low and sure. Then they'll find out what happens when they try to take something that finally means something. Clay nodded, and together they watched the fire burn. Chapter 9. The quiet between thunderclaps. A week passed. Then 2. The days ran simple, chores, mending, quiet evenings. Clay cut fence posts. Miriam made soap from ash and fat and wrapped bars in old cloth with careful, calloused hands. They spoke. Less now, not out of distance, but comfort. Every silence between them had a shape, a rhythm, a meaning all its own. The land responded too. The soil softened with spring rain. Wildflowers crept along the fence lines. A doe and her fawn started showing up in the far field, unbothered by Clay's presence. He wondered if peace could settle in a man's bones the way gunmetal once did. They were mending the chicken coop when the letter arrived. Young Luke Phelps rode out from Dust Creek with it in his shirt pocket, sweaty and serious. Miriam spotted him first and waved him down before Clay even looked up. Luke dismounted and handed over the note with 2 fingers, like it burned. "It came by rail, addressed to you both," he said. "From someone named Declan True." Clay's stomach tightened. Miriam opened it. "To Clay and Miriam Crowley, your names have been spoken far north of Dust Creek. Word is there's a bounty broker out of Cheyenne who ain't fond of unfinished business. He's hiring, quietly, men who know how to wait, to track. You should expect one before harvest. You'll know him when you see him. He always wears white." D.T. Miriam read it twice, then folded it slow. Clay stood, wiped his hands on his pants. "Well, that answers that." "Who's Declan True?" Miriam asked. "Old friend," Clay said. "If you count the kind who once saved your life, then tried to steal it back in a poker game. You trust him?" "I trust he has no reason to lie." Miriam slipped the letter into her apron pocket. "So what do we do?" Clay looked at the ridge, the graves, the path beyond. "We prepare." That night Miriam oiled the guns. Clay reinforced the locks. They stacked wood inside the door, filled the kerosene lamps, laid out the extra rounds. At one point, Clay paused and stared at her. "You regret this?" he asked. She didn't look up. "No. I brought danger to your doorstep. You brought a life to it." He nodded. Later, as the moon rose fat and yellow above the ridge, they sat by the fire, back where they'd burned the pardon. Clay took her hand. "If he comes, this man in white, we don't run." "No," she said. We don't." Miriam spent the next days teaching Clay how to read better. He could manage simple things, sure, but she insisted on harder texts. Chapters from the lives of saints, old land deeds, pages from the Bible in small script. She made him sound out every word, laughing when he skipped ahead. "Reckon you'll have me preaching next," he grumbled. "Maybe," she said. "But first you'll read me the rest of this book out loud, every page, even the boring parts." Clay glanced at the leather-bound cover. "This thing got a happy ending?" "Guess we'll find out," she said, and kissed him on the jaw. To me, days moved like cattle across a plain, steady, slow, and never in a straight line. But the feeling was back now, the tension, the watching. Miriam noticed it first, the sound of a branch snapping near the water pump. A boot print too deep behind. The smokehouse. The way the crows scattered twice in one day. "He's close," she said one evening. Clay nodded. "Tomorrow we start sleeping in shifts." She didn't argue. That night Clay sat on the porch with a rifle across his knees. The wind was soft, the stars loud, and somewhere out in the dark a man in white was coming. But for the first time in his life, Clay wasn't afraid. He had a name, a home, and a woman beside him who made both worth dying for. Chapter 10. The Man in White. He came at dawn, not with fanfare or thunder, no trumpet of hoofbeats, just a pale figure riding in quiet, casting no shadow, but leaving silence in his wake. His horse was the color of sun-bleached bone, its hooves nearly silent on the gravel. The man himself wore a white duster, long and clean despite the dust. White gloves, white hat. Pale eyes like milk turned sour. Miriam spotted him first from the kitchen window. "He's here," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Clay was already strapping on his revolver. They didn't speak. No need to. The man didn't stop at the gate. He rode straight into the yard and dismounted like he'd been here before. No hurry, no hesitation. Clay stepped out onto the porch. The man in white looked up at him. "You're Clay McGowan." "I am? You've got something that doesn't belong to you." Clay raised an eyebrow. "A name? A life? A woman who shoots straighter than you ever will?" The man didn't blink. "A debt, one that Cheyenne means to collect." Behind Clay, Miriam stepped into view, shotgun leveled. "You collected over our graves, then?" The man smiled faintly. "If I must." Clay stepped off the porch. "Name?" Not important. Wrong. You ride onto my land, aiming to end what don't need ending. You owe me a name. The man's pale lips curled. They called me Sloane once. Clay nodded. All right then, Sloane, let's settle this. They stood 10 paces apart in the clearing by the barn, the air heavy with dust and memory. Sloane moved like smoke, smooth, without edge. Clay felt every ache in his ribs, every ghost pressing down on his lungs. Miriam stood at the edge of the yard watching, a hand on the shotgun, ready but trusting. Clay had told her the night before, if it comes down to one shot, make it count. If I fall, you finish it. She'd nodded, and now she stood ready to do just that. Sloane's hand hovered near his hip. Last chance, Clay said. Sloane shook his head. You're already dead, McGowan. You just forgot to lay down. Then came the silence. Long, deep. The wind died. A crow cawed once, then nothing. Clay's hand moved first, but Sloane's gun cleared leather faster. The bullet caught Clay just above the hip. He staggered. Sloane smiled. Then Miriam fired. The shotgun roar shattered the morning. Sloane jerked, spun, and dropped like he'd been yanked by strings. Blood sprayed across the dust. Clay fell to one knee, teeth clenched, eyes still locked on the twitching white figure. Miriam was already beside him. You all right? She asked, voice tight. Clay coughed, winced. He was fast. You were. Faster. No, he said. We were. They buried Sloane out near the ridge. No marker, no words, just Clay and silence. The sun rose clean behind them as they stood over the fresh dirt. Miriam reached down, pressed a sprig of sage into the grave. For the smell, she said. Clay looked at her, the way the wind caught her hair, the way her eyes never once turned from what was hard. He's the last, Clay said. You sure? He nodded. The broker wanted proof. He'll get Sloane's gun in the post. That'll be enough. Miriam didn't ask how he knew. She just believed. That afternoon, Clay wrote the letter with his own hand. Signed it with his real name, McGowan. No alias, no lies. He sealed it, packed the gun, sent it off with Luke that same evening. By nightfall, it was done, and Clay sat on the porch beside his wife, blood bandaged, fire crackling, moon low. Still think you ain't a preacher? Miriam asked. He chuckled. Don't tempt me. I already got one bullet in me today. She leaned against him. You know, she said, if you ever want to leave this behind completely, we could go west. Real west. Past the mountains. Clay looked at the stars. One day, but not yet. Why not? He turned and smiled. Because right now, we've got peace. And a porch. And I want to sit here a while longer. Miriam nodded. They sat in. The dark. No fear. No running. And somewhere deep inside him, Clay McGowan finally laid his past to rest. Chapter 11. A name carved in Cedar Spring faded into summer, slow and golden. The earth baked beneath clear skies. Crops sprouted true for the first time in years. The windmill creaked steady. Dust Creek, once scarred and silent, began to hum again. Slow, cautious, but alive. Clay and Miriam built a new shed behind the house. A smokehouse followed. The porch got a second rocking chair. Clay carved it himself, sanding each slat until it fit Miriam's frame just right. She didn't thank him with words, just sat in it every morning with her coffee, a satisfied grunt when it didn't wobble. That was thanks enough. Luke Phelps came riding up one bright Tuesday, waving a letter in his hand and grinning like a fox in a henhouse. It came. He'd hollered before the mule had even stopped. Clay met him by the well, took the letter, and broke the seal with his thumb. He read it twice, then handed it to Miriam. Mr. McGowan, we received your parcel. The weapon was recognized. The debt is considered. Closed. No further action will be taken. You are free to live your life. Officially, we never spoke. Cheyenne Office, Registry of Claims. Miriam folded the paper and tucked it into her apron. It's done, Clay nodded. It's done. Then he turned to Luke. You hungry? That evening, Clay took a chisel and walked to the cedar tree by the ridge. The graves were still there, untouched. The grass had grown up around them soft and green, but there was one marker missing, not for a body. For a life he set to carving, not a name exactly, not his own, just words that finally felt true. Here stands the man who stayed. The summer rolled on. Miriam traded soap for seeds with the O'Malley family. Clay helped old Mr. Klein shingle his barn. On Sundays they sat in the rebuilt church and listened to Josiah preach under a new cross, the old Bible open in both hands. One Sunday Josiah paused mid-sermon and looked down at Clay. "Would you like to speak, brother?" Clay blinked. "Me? Seems you've lived a story worth sharing." The congregation turned. Clay stood slowly, hat in hand. "I was a bad man once," he said. "Mean, drunk on luck and fire, didn't believe in nothing I couldn't hold. Or steal." He glanced at Miriam sitting stone still in the front pew. "Then someone gave me a place to sit, a bed to bleed in, a voice in the dark that didn't flinch when it saw my scars." His voice caught. "I don't reckon I deserve what I got, but I'll keep earning it every day I breathe." He sat back down. Josiah nodded. "That'll preach." On the first cool day of September, Miriam handed Clay a tin box. Inside was a silver ring, simple and unpolished. "I found it in town," she said. "Traded soap for it." He took it, turned it in his hand. "You want me to wear it?" She nodded. "It's not iron, but it won't break easy." He slid it on, then pulled her close. They stood that way on the porch until the light faded, and when night came, they did not lock the door. They didn't need to anymore. By Chapter 12, The Storm That Didn't Come By. October, the evenings had turned crisp. The air held the scent of mesquite and smoke. Clay split wood in the mornings, stacking cords high against the barn wall. Miriam harvested what was left of the squash and okra, her apron heavy with the last stubborn tomatoes. The days shrank, the nights grew longer, and yet nothing dark pressed on them any more. No riders on the ridge, no bounty hunters down the trail. Just the quiet, steady rhythm of two people who had nothing left to prove, only something to protect. Clay rode into Dust Creek one morning to pick up nails and linseed oil. He hadn't shaved in a week, wore a coat that still smelled of creosote, and nodded at the few townsfolk who now called him neighbor without flinching. At the Mercantile, Miss Whitley handed him a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "This came for you from Kansas City," she said. Clay turned it over. No return name, just his, written clean and careful. He opened it on the porch of the general store. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. On the first page, "You've earned this silence. Use it however you like." D.T. He closed it slowly, held it in both hands like a weight he'd been waiting to carry. That evening, Clay brought the journal out to the porch. Miriam was sewing a rip in his coat. He handed it to her. "You plan on writing in it?" she asked. "Maybe. Your story?" He shook his head. "Ours." She nodded once and set it beside the lamp. "Just don't make me a saint," she said. He grinned. "Wouldn't dare." The next week brought a thunderstorm, one of those rolling, booming things that made the barn tremble and the chickens squawk. The wind howled. Rain battered the windows sideways. Lightning split the sky so clean it lit the room like a lantern. Clay lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the storm. Miriam reached for his hand beneath the quilt. "You dreaming?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just remembering." "What?" He stared at the ceiling. What it used to feel like. Running, hiding, not knowing who might come next. She didn't answer for a long time. Then, "You're not that man anymore." He turned to her. "I know. But sometimes the storm sounds like old boots on the porch." She looked him in the eye. "Then I'll be the one to open the door." He let out a breath, rolled closer, kissed her forehead. "You always were." Winter came early that year. They sealed the windows, stacked the last of the firewood. put the garden to bed beneath thick straw and hope. Dust Creek prepared too. Lanterns hung on porches, soup shared across fences, songs hummed in the church rafters like prayers carried on. The wind ought Clay and Miriam didn't travel that winter, didn't write to anyone. They stayed, together. Sometimes he read aloud. Sometimes she whittled buttons from old antlers. They talked of a second mule, a root cellar, maybe even a child, though they said it without pressure, like a dream one could turn over in the hand without having to hold. One morning Clay stood on the porch and watched the sun rise red and bold over the hills. He didn't think about the past. He didn't think about the next fight. He thought about Miriam inside, cooking eggs. He thought about the way the windmill spun now without complaint. He thought about the cedar tree with the carving no one but him would understand, and he smiled, because for the first time since the day he learned to hold a gun, he had nothing to run from, and nowhere he'd rather be. Chapter 13 of Bread and Bloodlines. The first snow came in November, silent and sudden, blanketing the earth in white, like forgiveness laid thick across the past. Clay stood at the window that morning, coffee in hand, watching the flakes settle on the porch rail. Miriam was behind him, kneading dough. Her sleeves rolled, her face set in calm determination. The wood stove hummed. The room smelled of yeast and pine, and Clay realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about dying. "I'm going to put in another row of beans next." "Spring," Miriam said, dusting flour from her wrists. Clay turned from the window. "That's ambitious." "I like ambitious," she replied, and he didn't miss the way her eyes lingered on him when she said it. They had visitors sometimes now. Josiah came once a week to read scripture and share news. Miss Whitley sent preserves. A widow from town brought yarn and sat with Miriam while they mended, neither speaking much, but both understanding the comfort of shared silence. Clay stayed near, fixed the porch rail, traded firewood for seed. And every evening, as dusk wrapped the world in blue shadow, he lit the lantern and sat with Miriam beside the fire. Some nights they talked. Some nights they just existed in the same space, wordless and warm. Both kinds of nights mattered. On the third Friday of the month, Miriam dropped a bowl on the floor. Clay turned at the sound, expecting frustration. But Miriam just stood there, hands on the edge of the table, eyes wide. "Something wrong?" he asked. "I think," she began, then stopped. A flush rose in her cheeks. Clay crossed the room. "You think what?" She looked up at him, and something in her face trembled. Not fear, not doubt, just the weight of something longed for, finally arriving. "I think I'm pregnant." Clay froze. For a second he didn't breathe. Then he let out a breath so long it felt like it emptied 10 years from his chest. "You sure?" "I ain't 100%, but I've known my body a long time, Clay. And this feels different." He took her hand, steady and slow. "You happy?" Her eyes welled. "I don't know yet, but I'm ready." Clay nodded, his throat tight. "Then so am I." They didn't rush into celebration. No announcement, no dance of joy, just a quieter sort of reverence. Miriam worked a little less, rested a little more. Clay started patching the spare room without being asked. He built a cradle from cedar scraps and lined it with cloth cut from Miriam's old dresses. Dust Creek buzzed with rumors, but no one came to ask. They knew better. Instead, folks started leaving gifts on the porch, a quilt, a jar of honey, an old book of lullabies, each one a silent wish for a future that hadn't been promised, but now felt possible. One night, as wind howled outside and the fire burned low, Clay sat up in bed and watched Miriam sleep. He remembered every moment that brought him here, every death, every lie, every mile run, and he felt none of it now, just the pull of tomorrow. He reached for the journal on the nightstand, opened it, and began to write, not about the man he had been, but about the child who might one day ask where he came from. He started with a name, Clay McGowan, then another, Miriam Crowley, then, slowly, the rest. Not because he wanted to remember, but because someone might need to know what it took to make a man stay. Chapter 14. The Shape of Belonging. December arrived with a sky like pewter and a hush that wrapped the land in reverence. Snow fell steady, soft as breath. Smoke curled from chimneys across Dust Creek like a hymn. Inside their cabin, Clay and Miriam prepared for a season unlike any they had known. The cradle stood by the fire now, empty but expectant. Miriam had sewn a little stuffed horse from spare wool. Clay had whittled a toy revolver, harmless and smooth, more charm than threat. They didn't speak of what could go wrong, not because they were naive, but because they understood how fragile hope could be, and still they hoped. On the second Sunday of Advent, Josiah arrived with an orange wrapped in paper and a worn hymnal in hand. He stayed for supper, said a quiet blessing, talked little, but before he left he gave Clay a slip of folded parchment. "It's from the registry office," he said. "After what happened with Sloan, they filed your marriage officially, name and all." Clay looked at the paper. "Mr. and Mrs. Clay Crowley," he smiled. "She made me honest." Josiah clapped him on the shoulder. "She made you whole." That week, Clay finished patching the roof, just in time. A blizzard came down from the north, fierce and mean. They stayed inside, wrapped in quilts, playing checkers by lantern light. On the fourth night of the storm, Clay woke to find Miriam shivering beside him. "You all right?" She nodded slowly. "Just everything stretching, changing." He held her hand. "You want me to read?" She nodded again, so he did. From the journal. He read what he had written about the first time he saw her, the night he stumbled half dead into Josiah's church, the cold in his lungs, the way she held the needle with fingers that didn't tremble. Miriam closed her eyes, listening. When he finished, she whispered, "You made me strong too, you know." In early January, Clay rode to town alone. Miriam had asked him to find fabric, something soft, something warm. She didn't say it outright, but Clay knew she was thinking ahead. Swaddling, curtains, maybe even something for herself for afterward. Miss Whitley handed him a wrapped parcel and winked. "Tell her we'll throw her a gathering come spring." No arguments, Clay nodded. She might argue anyway. Then we'll do it behind her back. On the way home, Clay passed a young couple walking the ridge, newlyweds from North Hollow. The man waved. Clay returned it. The woman said, "That the Crowleys' place up ahead?" "It is. Heard it's the safest place in the valley." Clay didn't answer, but the words stayed with him the rest of the way home. That night, Miriam laid her head in his lap while he read. Her breath was slow, heavy. He paused, rested the book on his knee. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. She didn't open her eyes. "Have what?" "This quiet. This stillness. A reason to build something instead of bury it." She reached for his hand, held it like it was the thing tethering her to the earth. "You do," she said. "You built me." And Clay, whose whole life had been shaped by bullets and running and the fear of his own shadow, felt the shape of belonging settle inside his chest. It felt like her hand in his. It felt like home. Chapter 15. First Light. The day came without warning. It was February. The snow still crusted over the ridgeline, ice thick along the eaves. Clay had just come in from splitting logs when he heard the sound from the bedroom. Low, strained more. Breath, then voice. Miriam. He dropped the bundle of kindling, rushed. She was on her knees beside the bed, gripping the mattress, sweat already purling on her brow. "It's time," she said, her voice tight with pain but calm. Clay froze. Then moved water, towels, blankets, boiled rags. He remembered every word Josiah had told him, remembered how many times he'd prayed not to be here for this. But he was. He wanted to be. Miriam gritted through the contractions. No scream, no panic, just grit and breath and a wild glint hands, her eyes like a storm refusing to bend. "It hurts," she whispered once. "I know." "You don't." Clay took her hand. "You're right, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And he didn't. For hours, through every wave, every groan, he wiped her forehead, held her, whispered her name, and when the final moment came, when the room split open with pain and the sharp gasp of new life, he caught the child in trembling hands and wept. It was a girl. Tiny, red, loud. Miriam collapsed back on the bed, eyes rimmed with tears, but fierce with something deeper. Clay wrapped the infant in a warm cloth and laid her gently in her mother's arms. Miriam looked down, then up at him. "She's got your mouth," she said. "She's got your fire," he answered. They sat that way until the stove went cold and the light shifted. Josiah came the next morning. Didn't ask if he was welcome, just walked in, steaming coffee in hand, and sat at the edge of the bed. "Well," he said, voice cracking, "I'll be damned." Clay smiled. "Not if you keep bringing coffee." Josiah looked down at the baby, swaddled between them. "What's her name?" Miriam and Clay exchanged a glance. Then she said, "Mercy." Josiah exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since yesterday. "That fits." The town came in trickles, one family at a time. No loud congratulations, just offerings, a jar of beans, a knitted cap, a promise to shovel the path. Dust Creek had long memories, but it also had a heart, and it had learned, through Clay and Miriam, not everything broken stays that way. That night Clay stood by the window watching snow fall under a full moon. Mercy slept in the cradle. Miriam dozed. In the rocker, he opened the journal. Wrote only one sentence. "She came with the snow, and I was never the same again." Outside, the wind howled. But inside, the fire burned steady, and Clay McGowan, killer, outlaw, husband, father, stood in the center of it all, no longer running. He had a name, he had a family, and he had one more chapter to live. Chapter 16. What remains? Spring returned, slow and muddy. The snow melted into the soil, feeding the roots of last year's labor. The creek ran high, the hills turned green. Mercy began to smile. Not the soft flutters of a newborn, but real, full grins that took over her entire face and made Clay forget every scar he carried. Miriam said the girl had her father's stubbornness and her mother's lungs. She'd wail like the world was ending, then fall asleep with her hand wrapped around Clay's thumb. He didn't mind the noise. He'd lived long enough in silence. They planted early. Beans, onions, squash. Miriam drew rows with her boot heel, while Mercy watched from a sling on her chest. Clay did most of the heavy lifting, but let Miriam lead. She knew the soil, like scripture. When they rested, they sat on the porch swing Clay had built just after the thaw. It hung from iron chains and creaked pleasantly in the breeze. Some evenings Clay would read aloud, Mercy would gurgle, Miriam would hum. Clay had never known peace could sound like that. The journal filled slowly, not with violence or names of the dead, but stories of laughter, of the sound of Mercy's first real giggle, of the time she peed on Josiah's shoe, of how Clay caught himself calling Miriam my love without realizing it. He wrote it all, not for himself, not even for Mercy, but for the man he used to be, the one who might have believed such things were beyond him. He needed that man to see it. In April, a writer came, not a gunman, not a bounty hunter, just a boy with a telegram from Kansas City. Clay read it, frowned, read it again. "Well?" Miriam asked. "It's from Declan True." Her eyebrows rose. "Thought he disappeared." "He did? But now he's asking me to come north. One last job, he says. Says it's not for money, it's for justice." Miriam watched him. "You going?" Clay didn't answer right away. Then he tore the telegram in two. "No," he said. "That part of me's buried. And I'm not digging it up." She nodded once, slowly, then placed Mercy in his arms. "Good," she said, "because she likes this version of you best." By June, the cabin was alive with color. Miriam planted marigolds in the window boxes. Mercy began to crawl. Clay finally fixed the last crooked board on the front porch. One afternoon, a group of children from Dust Creek came by chasing a runaway dog. When Clay handed the pup over, one of the boys said, "My pa says you used to, too. Be the meanest man west of Cheyenne." Clay leaned down and smiled. That so? The boy nodded. He says now you just split wood and kiss your wife a lot. Clay laughed. Well, your pa ain't wrong. The children ran off, and Clay watched them disappear into the brush, heart full. The last entry in the journal came on Mercy's first birthday. Clay wrote it in the early dawn, the house still quiet, the sun not yet up. This is the last chapter. Not because the story ends, but because it no longer belongs to me. It belongs to the woman who saw through blood and smoke and gave me a name worth saying aloud. It belongs to the child who taught me what it means to begin again. It belongs to this land, this porch, this morning light. I was a dying outlaw once. But then I stayed, and staying, God help me, was the bravest thing I ever did. He closed the book and went inside to wake his girls.